Hi, I'm Dr. Howard Zucker, and this is Bessie the cow with Carly the bird. Now, I've stared at that bird and that cow on the glass shelves over there for 30 years, but now they have an eerie relevance. Last summer, while flipping through the public health journals, I started reading about cows in California coming down with H5N1, which is the technical name for the bird flu virus. It has to do with the proteins on their surface. The H5N1 bird flu, it's come and gone several times since first appearing back in Scotland in 1959. Back then, there were about 200 birds that had this. They were killed. It seemed to end the problem. But since then, it's made the jump. It went from Scotland to Asia in 1996. It went from chickens to people. And it also killed hundreds of people before it was stopped. And what they did was basically swift interventions. They vaccinated farm workers. They closed the open air markets, which allowed the bird flu to go from bird to bird. And they also killed 1.5 million chickens to stop the spread. Well, I became alarmed last summer when I saw that it had made the leap to cows, like Bessie over here. And it was clear that another mutation in the bird flu virus had occurred. And we weren't ready for it last August. So that brings us to the topic today. Are we ready for bird flu today? Well, no need to panic. The name of this podcast is Docology. I'm the doc part, and ology, well, ology means the study of. And this podcast will examine the most pressing health issues. And through the experts that we have on, we're going to learn a lot more. We're going to have more knowledge. We're going to get stronger. We're going to get smarter together. And today we've got one of the most intelligent people in the world on the issue of bird flu. That's Dr. Jennifer Nuzzo. She is the director of the Pandemic Center at Brown University. She's an epidemiologist, and she's going to give us some advice about what we should do about this potential bird flu outbreak. She advises countries around the world. And if you're a Docology subscriber, you'll be able to join my conversation with Dr. Nuzzo on camera or in the chat. So please welcome Dr. Jennifer Nuzzo.
Thank you. I thank you for joining me. It is great to have you as our inaugural podcast guest. We've spoken over the years about public health concerns, and here we are again, another potential crisis, right? WHO has reported 900 people in 25 countries that have this bird flu, and they've even said that 1 in 2 have died. To me, that is alarming. So let's jump right in and address what I'm sure everyone is wondering. With the many animal species getting this now, including cats and obviously dairy farms as well, with cows, with more and more humans, fortunately, no person-to-person spread yet. What's the real risk to the American public?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. We have been talking about this virus for a really long time. And in many ways, there's new reasons to be concerned in the last year or so. But for right now, if you're not someone who has regular contact with animals that are likely to get infected with this, and that's been primarily wild birds, also domesticated birds, but to some extent also cows and other farm animals. If you're not someone who's in regular contact with animals that are likely to get sick, I don't think this is something that you have to put on your day-to-day worry list. We're worried about this virus for other reasons, but for now, for most people, the risk of getting infected is quite low.
Excellent. Thank you. That's probably going to go a lot of people out there. I was wondering, maybe you could take us inside your pandemic center. Tell us a little bit about what you are worried about, what you're hearing, what you're thinking about, and maybe what you're hearing from the CDC as well.
Yeah. So we started the Pandemic Center at Brown a few years ago, actually as a kind of direct reaction to all of the challenges of COVID-19 and seeing that events like COVID was not going to be a one-off. It was not going to be a once-in-a-century crisis. It was probably going to be something that could happen more and more frequently in the future. We wanted to make sure that we could get prepared for those events. Ideally, we could prevent such events, but at the very least, we can get prepared to respond to those events such that we never again let them upend our lives in the way that COVID-19 did. Figure out how to make ourselves better ready for them, more resilient, so that we can protect people and society, but not have to stop what we're doing and shut everything down like we had to do in COVID-19. So the things that we're worried about, unfortunately, the list of things that we're worried about just grows and grows. I mean, it really hasn't slowed down since COVID. The number of concerning outbreaks that are happening, not just here in the United States, but around the world, continues to grow. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And there's a lot of reasons to think that the list will just continue to get longer. So it's really important to think about what systems, what tools, what strategies do we need to be ready for these events such that when they happen, they don't harm us in the ways that we fear they could.
Well, the alarm bells started ringing in 2022 with these infected birds. And so I just want to touch on the risk a little bit, given that there are so many species. Is it only a matter of time before it mutates? I mean, essentially, with all these animals, is nature just running a little wild?
Yeah. So the short answer is we don't know. This virus is mutating, and it has been mutating. Even in the last year, we've seen concerning mutations occur. But we have been tracking this virus for now more than 20 years. We've been very worried about it, in part because that 900 people infected, that figure that you cited, has occurred in that amount of time. So not a tremendous number of human infections are still rare. But when they occur, they tend to be deadly. Recent infections haven't been deadly. We don't know why that is, but we very much fear that future infections could be deadly. It is still mostly a virus that affects birds. It is not a virus that is particularly good right now at infecting humans. But over the last year, we have really seen it expand, both in terms of the number of countries that are finding infections and the number of species of animals that are getting infected, including in the last year, in particular, mammals like dairy cows that humans spend a lot of time with. So the more we have contact with this virus, the more concerned we are that this virus may be getting better able to infect mammals, which we are considered to be, but also that it could mutate in very significant ways, or probably a more likely scenario for it to become a worry to humans is that it could combine with a human influenza virus. Like if someone were to get infected with the avian virus and the human virus, and then it could combine. And if it combined in such a way that gave the virus the ability to easily infect people and spread between people, we would be in another pandemic. And so that's the scenario that is kind of behind why people are talking about this virus so much. We're also worried about the people who are getting infected while caring for animals, like dairy workers, and we just don't want them to have be harmed by this virus, knowing that it has historically been a pretty deadly virus.
In 1918, the pandemic that we all hear about killed 50 to 100 million people. Is that even possible today with the technology and the modern medicine that we have? Or is that something that's probably just left for the history books?
Yeah, so putting 1918 into context, that 50 million figure, first of all, we have to acknowledge that it happened at a time when the world's population was much, much smaller. So that is quite a historically deadly event. And why it was so deadly is probably a product of a number of factors. I think World War I played a big role in terms of putting a whole lot of people together, people who are particularly vulnerable to infection, and then moving them around the planet. So that factor, I'm sure, played a big role. But also, we didn't have a whole lot of tools in 1918. We didn't have things like antibiotics or modern medical equipment that we would use to save people's lives were it to happen today. That said, 1918 wasn't the most deadly virus we have ever seen. And so there is still the possibility that we could have a pandemic that is worse than 1918, were the virus to be more deadly. We also don't necessarily have the kind of bandwidth in our healthcare system to deal with large numbers of infected, critically ill people and to be able to give them the life-saving care that we would otherwise wish to be able to give them. So
I am worried about the system.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. I am worried about the health system because it seems like a lot of hospitals where I speak to colleagues there, they've gone back to the pre-COVID way of operating, at 98, 99% occupancy. And where is the surge capacity? How do we make sure that we're ready if something like an H5N1 pandemic occurs in the United States?
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, we talk about the H5N1, historically, half of the people that we've ever known to get it have died. Now, as I said, the recent cases haven't been as deadly, and we don't understand why that is. But we can't throw out 20 years worth of data. So half is an extraordinary number. We don't think that's probably the accurate number. We think we're probably missing some mild infections, but when they've done studies in outbreak settings, they haven't found that we're missing like twice as many cases. So it's a deadly virus. By comparison, COVID, 1% case fatality ratio, so it is far less lethal by comparison, and yet we saw how devastating that was for our health system.
That's it. Yeah.
And so thinking about what a future pandemic could do, we see very quickly how weak our health systems are to be able to handle much more than day to day, which, if you've gone to seek care in an emergency room, you know how challenging it is to get seen and how long you have to wait, even when there is not some deadly crisis happening.
Whether it's 1918 or 2025, I'm sure everyone in their home wonders, what should they have? Are there certain things that they should have to prepare, whether masks, PPEs, testing? What would you recommend that they have in their house?
Yeah, so the good news is we just went through the drill, right? We went through COVID-19. We know what it takes to protect ourselves, and those same tools that we chose to avail ourselves of, we can use when and if it becomes important to protect ourselves against not just a future flu pandemic, but really any respiratory viral infection. So masks are likely to play a role. The good news about H5N1, again, it's not spreading between people yet. I have to stress that because a lot of people hear us talk about it and think that that's what's happening. It is not. We're talking about a future scenario. So the good news is it's a flu virus. And, it's the influenza A flu virus, which is like our seasonal influenza viruses. So we have tests in existence. We have medicines in existence. They have been working on vaccines. We know how to make pandemic influenza vaccines. We did it in a 2009 pandemic, a flu pandemic that happened. So there are tools. The question, of course, is would we have enough, and how long would it take to amass sufficient quantities of them in a pandemic? Again, that's not today.
That's true. I mean, as long as we're in everyone's house right now talking about what they should have, one of the issues, let's just go into that kitchen for a minute. Everyone is worried about the eggs in the refrigerator and what they're buying. Maybe you can give us a little information on what is real about this whole issue with the eggs.
Yeah, so I'm not really worried about eggs. I mean, again, human infections are rare, and they are the vast, vast, vast majority of them are in people who have had exposure to sick animals. There have been a few cases that we haven't known where people have gotten the infections, but it probably is something out in the environment. Public health officials have long been telling you to cook your eggs properly and not to eat runny eggs. I will admit to not being great at following that advice, but that same rules applies, and it's not just about H5N1, it's just about other pathogens in general. But I'm not really worried about eggs. I'm not worried about pasteurized milk. I am worried about unpasteurized milk because the dairy cows who are infected actually produce a large quantity of virus in the milk. And it is likely that other animals and possibly dairy workers are getting sick from being exposed to that unpasteurized milk. Pasteurized milk shouldn't be a problem because the heat inactivates the virus, and they've now done many studies to show that's the case. Similarly, people ask about meat. And again, public health officials have long told you to cook your meat to the proper internal temperature. And provided you follow that advice, that should be fine. Again, we haven't seen any cases associated with consumption of undercooked eggs or meat. So that's not top of my worry list.
So this is one of those challenges for the farms, obviously. And I did hear that the administration has put in $500 million to $1 billion for the agriculture from the agriculture department, because as you mentioned before, pigs obviously could have a avian flu and a human flu, and they can mix. And the next thing you know, we're going to have some potential virus that can spread person to person, which is clearly a risk. And so farms with pigs and cows, are a risk. So that's something I guess we have to look at. And I guess there's not going to be some spider on wherever it's going to type it.
Charlotte, I don't know if Charlotte Viv is going to.
Some
Save us in this scenario. Pigs, you're right. We do worry a lot about pigs in particular because for a long time they've been considered what they call a mixing vessel. They have some receptors that are kind of like birds and some receptors that are kind of like humans. And the thought is that they could be the place where the more human-like influenza viruses and the bird-like influenza viruses could mix and swap genes in a way that could give a new virus that humans don't usually get the ability to more easily infect and spread between people. I will say I'm not sure pigs are the only risk. I do think humans could potentially be a mixing vessel of ourselves because of dairy workers being exposed to H5N1 when they're caring for sick animals or exposed to sick animals. It's one of the reasons why I've been so worried about making sure we are protecting dairy workers or other farm workers, because again, one, we want to protect them and protect their health, but also we want to prevent them from becoming infected with two viruses, which just increases our worries about a potential pandemic.
But on the issue of coordination, because the farms is people, what about coordination at government levels, local, state, and federal government? What would you recommend that we should be doing to prevent some kind of lack of coordination? And how should you advise others to do that?
Yeah, so this has been a bit challenging, and I think it's one of the reasons why the situation in the United States has just gotten worse as opposed to getting better. I mean, right now, the United States is a country that's reporting the most amount of H5N1 cases in the country. And part of that is because it's here and we're a large country, but it's also circulating on U.S. farms. And one of the challenges in responding to it is that the people who are thinking about keeping farms, regulating farms, are not the same people who are thinking about protecting human health. Right. So this has created challenges at the federal level, just different government agencies having different responsibilities, and no single U.S. federal agency responsible for protecting humans from animal diseases. So there's a bureaucratic chasm here that this virus is exploiting. But also at the state level, similar trends exist. What we do know is that in places, particularly states, where there are good relationships between public health and agriculture, it's been more straightforward in terms of responding to outbreaks on farms and making sure the workers on those farms have, the tools they need to protect themselves. Right. So what I would say is that really that's what the key factor is, making sure that coordination and collaboration is there and it's built on good relationships. Now, we've just been through 5 years of pandemic. We have a very weary public and we have very weary government officials who sometimes respond to infectious disease and think, oh, they're coming to shut us down. And we have to make it clear that trying to protect farm workers and farms against H5N1 should not be about shutting the farms down or in any way interfering with their livelihood. I think what it's going to need is giving the farms more tools to be able to handle this virus so that it doesn't cut into their profits in the way we've already seen this virus too. So we know that cows that get infected have decreased milk production. That's a very costly loss. We know that poultry farms, particularly egg layers, have been devastated by this virus. And it's one of the reasons why it's been so hard and so expensive to get eggs in the grocery store. So we need to give tools.
If you had an opportunity to sit down with the new Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy Jr., what would be your advice to him regarding whether it's vaccines or antivirals or just managing the potential for outbreak?
So I do think we should be talking about vaccines for farm workers. Again, not mandated. I think provided offered on a voluntary basis. I think, some people who are regularly exposed to animals that are getting sick may appreciate having extra protection. We know that they could be using personal protective equipment and other things, but we also know in these settings, it's really hard, particularly hot, hen houses in the middle of the summer, that's a very hard situation to be outfitting yourself properly in personal protective equipment. I think it's still important, but we know it's not being done. So in those settings, I think vaccines are important tools to offer people so that if they do get sick, they don't get severely ill, which is something that we would still worry about.
I do want to get to our audience, but one question before we go to our subscribers. Mm-hmm. With COVID, everyone had their opinions, and sometimes their opinions differed. And how do we address this? How do we look at the concerns of people who don't necessarily agree with conventional public health wisdom? And how would you approach that if there were another pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, it's been a long-standing observation and truism in public health is that if the public's not on your side, you don't have a public. So first of all, there is no way to end run around people's feelings on things. I mean, the hope is that you can bring people along. And I think part of what it means to bring them along is to start with listening and listening to what values are and to not, necessarily default to mandates because it's expedient. I think in the case of H5N1, I think one of the things we need to do is to listen to the farm workers and the farm owners and say, what tools would be helpful to you? What can we give you to help you manage this? Because I know none of them want to get sick themselves, or they don't want their workers to get sick or their animals to get sick. So what kind of tools do they need? Do they need tests that they can use in the privacy of their own operations so that they can make better decisions about how to keep everyone safe? What other resources do they need? I think we have to start with listening and asking people and just work to build those relationships. You can't show up in a crisis and have, a productive conversation by just showing up in an emergency and saying you have no choice but to do this.
Well, Joe, we've had a chance to speak about a lot of topics. I could go on for hours about other things, international health organizations and everything else. But this is when we turn to our most important guests, which is our subscribers out there. So as we tee that up for their questions and their concerns, I just want to mention that what we share on the podcast is for informational purposes. It's not in the place of a doctor's visit. It is important for you to listen to your doctor about individual medical recommendations and because they know your medical history. But let's hear what our subscribers are wondering about. Kat, can we put on our first Docology caller for today?
Bringing up Jen here. We have Jen with a question.
Excellent. Jen.
Jen there. I'm just wondering if you can address which segments of the population are most vulnerable to bird flu. Is it elderly or is it young children? I mean, I know you said it's not of imminent concern right away, but as this mutates and grows, what do you suspect the most vulnerable population will be?
Great question. Jennifer?
Yeah. So the human infections are rare, and most of them have been in adults. But given that this is an influenza virus, were the virus to infect more people, I think we would expect it to behave like other influenza viruses, in which case, typically, those at risk are the very old and the very young. And then people with underlying health conditions. That's typical for most of the pathogens we deal with. There are some questions and some interesting recent data about whether certain ages may have a little bit of extra protection based on their having been exposed to earlier flu viruses that might be more like this H5N1. And so there have been some instances in which we see older folks maybe a little bit more protected than we would typically expect. But I will say this is an interesting observation that can guide scientific research. It's not really enough to base a public health recommendation on. So I would say, we don't really know for sure, but it's generally the very old and the very young. That said, there was a teenager in British Columbia who was in the hospital for more than a month after being infected with this virus. Don't know how this teenager contracted it, but lived in close proximity to a wildlife sanctuary, so possibly from an environmental exposure. So I will just say, well, we can tell you this on the population level. It's really hard to know on the individual level how people will be infected and what exactly governs it. But I think if you're asking the general question, I think thinking of this like we think of other flu viruses, we kind of know generally what those risk factors are. Howard mentioned the 1918 influenza pandemic. And one of the interesting observations about that pandemic was that we saw this interesting kind of triple peak curve in terms of who died. And the middle peak, we had the very young, of course, and the very old, which we expect. But the middle peak was like young adults. And that's been an interesting historical mystery as to why that is, why that virus may have acted differently than many other viruses. I think that the science is still there's still the question marks there, but it is also possible, as I mentioned before, that the war had something to do with it, that we had a whole lot of young people who were fighting in World War I who were being exposed in ways that we just don't typically see. And therefore, that may explain some of that increased mortality in that age. But at the very least, I think the very young and the very old are kind of top of the worry list.
I guess a lot of vigilance is really important. I mean, we saw with COVID, with kids, right? We originally felt kids didn't get sick and they handle it well. And then all of a sudden that multi-system inflammatory syndrome children up and you're worried about that. So I guess vigilance and being compulsive is important. Thank you. Great question. Kat, who's up?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. So next we're going to come to Ronnie for her question. I'm going to add her up here.
Hi, Ronnie. How are you?
Hi, good. Thank you so much. This is a topic that I'm very, very concerned about. I'm worried about another pandemic, worried about the fatality level that you all were discussing. It seems that it's a much more dangerous virus. So with that in mind, I have a two-part question. What is the status of the vaccine for H5N1? And secondly, is there enough for the whole U.S.?
Great point. Jeff, you're up to speed on this, given what you're hearing.
So the good news, and this is why when someone asks, like, should we get prepared for a future pandemic? This is one of the things I can point to. So we've been working on this virus for a long time. And our worries about this virus never come to fruition. That would be the best case there. But in worrying about this virus, one of the things that's been going on since almost 20 years ago has been trying to develop and stockpile H5N1 vaccines. Now, H5N1 today is still not good at infecting people, and it's still not good at spreading. It can't really spread between people. And to be able to do that better, it needs to change. So the pandemic virus is not that virus. So it's a little bit of a challenge here because we've developed vaccines for what we think the virus looks like based on what we've seen, but that's not necessarily what the pandemic virus is. So we do have vaccines, and we do have them stockpiled in various degrees of readiness. Not enough for the entire population. I think planning scenarios never anticipate, or in the case of flu, that the entire population would get the vaccine. And I think that's a questionable assumption. I think it's based on the fact that only about 10% of the country gets vaccinated against seasonal flu. But again, in a pandemic, if it were more deadly, I think the demand would be different. But even with COVID, we didn't get the whole country vaccinated. So we don't have enough for everybody. But we do have stuff. We don't just have vaccines. We also have therapeutic medicines that can be used to treat. We also do have tests available and other things. The wild card is this virus will change before it becomes a pandemic, and how much it will change and whether what we have, how protective it will be is the question. We can't know. But the good news is we know how to make a pandemic influenza vaccine. We've done it before. We have the infrastructure. It's not like COVID. In March of 2020, we had no idea if in a year we would have multiple safe and effective vaccines. But with the flu pandemic, we do know that we will very likely have a vaccine. It just takes time. It'll probably take about 6 or so months to really ramp up to sufficient quantities if we have to just make it from scratch.
And the messenger RNA technology that we have now will expedite that, I believe. So
yeah, absolutely. Actually, that's one of the reasons why they have been trying to make some progress on developing mRNA vaccines, in part because if you make vaccines by a different way, it frees up, it just creates additional capacity to make vaccines. And so that means you could have more quantities of vaccines faster. We have to say this now because the future of those contracts are actually in question right now because there's been some political movement to potentially cancel them. And I just want to put out there what the rationale for mRNA vaccines are. Yes, traditional flu vaccines are a likely path, but in a pandemic, you kind of want as many options as possible.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great question also, Ronnie. Kat, who else do we have up?
All right. So now we're going to bring in Anna with a question dropped in the chat.
Hi, Dr. Zucker. Hi, Dr. Nuzzo. Thank you so much. My question is about backyard birds. So I love feeding the birds in my backyard. And, I go out and touch the feeders a lot when I'm adding bird feed. Should I be worried about making contact with the feeders? And if so, is washing my hands enough to keep me protected?
Yeah. So one kind of, well, this is bad. This is both bad and good. I mean, birds tend, when they get this, they tend to die. And when they've done studies, serologic studies, wild birds, typically they found not a lot of asymptomatic infection. So if you're seeing birds dying, I would definitely keep your distance. But in terms of the feeders, I'm not particularly worried, especially if you're doing it outside. Definitely wash your hands. You should do that anyway. There's other pathogens that we worry about, but I'm not really, if you're going into like a hen house and you're worried that the virus may have got in there and there's like some stir up of the material, you might want to wear a mask while you're doing it, actually eye protection too. But for the most part, I mean, the people who are getting infected are being exposed to sick animals. We see more asymptomatic infections in the cows. The chickens tend to die, and a lot of the people who have gotten sick from the chickens are people who are sent in to cull the infected flocks. So, it is, I would definitely avoid birds that look ill.
Okay. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Anna. While we tee up the next person, just a quick thing on that last point. I just was wondering about the fact that a lot of people are concerned when they have backyard balls and flocks. And I read something that said that veterinarians have had antibodies to the bird, even though they weren't exposed. So are people actually getting exposed that we are not aware of? And if we did a testing of antibodies in people, would that show anything?
Yeah. So the vet study that you talked about was mostly vets dealing with cows. But yes, they have done serologic studies. So that looks for evidence of prior infection, not people who are sick. They have found more people were infected than they knew about. Now, whether those people were sick and we just didn't really know, maybe they had very mild symptoms, or they had no symptoms at all, we don't exactly know. The reassuring news is that while they found more, they didn't find a whole lot. So when they've done these studies, it's like 2% or 7%. It's not like 50%. So yes, we are missing infections, but I don't think we're missing a whole, submerged iceberg of infections. That's both good news and bad news. It's good news because it means that this thing isn't really spreading much further. But it's also bad news because some people think, well, maybe this isn't so deadly. Maybe there's a whole lot of mild infections or asymptomatic infections that we've missed. And if you were to count all those people, the 50% of the 900 that died is maybe more like 10 or 5%. But the reality is it's not really. We've kind of found a lot of the infections, and historically, nearly half of them have died.
Excellent. That's helpful because you never know what's out there, what people are actually exposed to on a regular basis. Kat, do we have our next subscriber?
We have John here who has a great question from the chat.
Hi. This has been so interesting. And I say that not just because I'm a proud Brown University. I'm glad that we have the pandemic side. I had two things, because you just mentioned something about potentially defunding mRNA research. What is that about?
Yeah, well, two things. What we have heard is that HHS, so the Department of Health and Human Services, which under the Biden administration issued contracts with some vaccine manufacturers to work on the development of an mRNA-based H5N1 vaccine. That those questions are being scrutinized, and there is concerns that those contracts may be canceled, which would mean then not doing the research and development necessary to develop an mRNA vaccine. Now, we don't yet have an mRNA vaccine for H5N1, so there still is a scientific discovery process that has to happen. We don't know if the end of it would result in a vaccine, but we are hopeful that it would have. So that's one thing that's concerning. And then the other thing is that there was a news story, at least today, indicating that NIH was signaling to some academic grantees that there may be a rescinding of H5N1, mRNA related research potentially in other settings like academic settings. Not specific to H5N1, just generally mRNA, because there's been unfortunate political backlash against this technology, which is not just for COVID vaccines. I mean, it is also one of a promising avenue of treatment for hideous diseases like pancreatic cancer. So were we to kind of pull back on mRNA vaccine research at this stage of what really seems like really promising early days, we could really be shutting off the pathway to a number of important tools, not just vaccines for infectious diseases, but also potentially treating some of the worst cancers that have, many people, have lost loved ones to. So there's somewhere. Now, none of this is for certain. And I think one of the things to make sure it doesn't become for certain is to make sure that people understand what this technology is, what it could potentially do, and why research and development with it is so important. In the case of H5N1, one of the reasons it's important, as I said, is because having different kinds of vaccines may mean making more vaccines faster. And I don't mean faster like we're cutting corners, just that it's just, turning on more hoses at the same time. But the other reason is that mRNA is interesting because, like I said, the virus that will cause the pandemic isn't the one that's occurring today. It will have to change. And people like mRNA vaccine technology because it allows you to make changes to the vaccine a bit more quickly than the traditional approach, which requires growing the virus in chicken eggs. Again, this is an avian flu virus. It doesn't grow very easily in chicken eggs. So that's a very slow process. So having mRNA, which is produced in a different way, that's possibly produced a bit more flexibly, may mean just having more flexible options sooner. So it's, I think, a really promising area of research. And, I think it would behoove us to see it as such, to not try to turn off developments before we get them.
Thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. Without taking a position one way or another politically, is there a scientific concern that's spurring the pullback on the research, or is it some ancillary issue like immoral or ethical or something?
Yeah, it's been an unfortunate political persecution of a vaccine technology based on false read of the safety data. So COVID vaccines, we have to remember that the majority of the US and the majority of the world have been vaccinated with it. It is by and large proven itself to be enormously safe and effective. However, there are people who assert that there have been some issues, and there have been some issues. With any vaccine, you have some issues. But by and large, the vaccines have been overwhelming lifesavers. But some have tried to suggest that they cause more harm than they actually do. And, rather than pursue the development of future technologies and rigorously evaluate safety and efficacy as we do for every new vaccine and other medical technology that gets developed, they just rather kind of shut the whole thing down for political points, it feels like.
But well, hopefully scientists will find a way forward, which, we have to stay optimistic about that. I did read that article about mRNA vaccines. That was a little concerning. We're getting at the sort of the end of our hour or 40 minutes, I should say. Kat, do we have others, or where are we?
That was actually the last one.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you, Jennifer. What a pleasure to have you share your wisdom and your expertise and all your perspectives on this. And you have an open invitation to come back on the podcast to talk about the pandemic. That would be great. Hopefully, we don't end up with a huge problem, but just in case. Well, that is it for our show today. On Wednesday, we will talk about the measles outbreak with Dr. Adam Ratner. And remember, if you are a Docology subscriber, you can join the show. Just click on the link in the bio. So tune in next time, because the topic we cover may just save your life.